Jane has always been an observant girl. From a young age, she learned to gauge the looks of her Aunt Patricia, a woman who seemed to carry within her a coldness that chilled any room. The kind of woman who smiles, but whose smile doesn't reach her eyes, and whose sharp gaze always seemed to be searching for something, or rather, someone to control. And her obsession was her daughter's. Lucia, the eldest, was perfect in Patricia's eyes, beautiful, educated, and with a bright future ahead of her. Karina, the youngest, seemed to live in her sister's shadow, always striving to stand out, but never quite managing to overcome the image of the younger sister. Jane, on the other hand, was never truly part of that equation. She wasn't a daughter, she wasn't of noble blood, and all that was left for her was to be the housemaid. She knew her place, but she didn't want to accept it. That particular morning, something was in the air. Jane wasn't sure what it was, but she could feel it. It was as if fate had decided to intervene. As Patricia entered the kitchen, her firm footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Jane," she called, her voice sharp as a blade. "Do you have something to tell me?" The question hung in the air, lingering with unbearable tension. Jane nervously lowered her head, trying not to pay too much attention to Patricia's eyes, which watched her as if she were a child. But Patricia already knew the answer, and the question was nothing more than a psychological game, a test to see how far Jane would go to hide the truth. I don't understand," Auntie Jane murmured, her voice hesitant. Patricia gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't make me repeat myself. I heard Mr. Wellington's son will be in town soon. Do you have something to do with it?" She dropped the bombshell with disturbing calm, as if Jane's life were just another piece on a chessboard. Jane, who had been in control until that moment, felt a chill run down her spine. She knew the stakes were much higher than she had imagined. The truth is, even though she was treated like a servant, Jane had always known something. Patricia never wanted to leave the confines of the house. Mr. Wellington's son, a billionaire she and her daughters, Lucia and Karina, had been eyeing for years. Patricia didn't just want her daughters to marry well, she wanted them to marry the future, and the future lay with Wellington. Jane, however, never imagined her life would somehow become intertwined with that name. I heard," Jane replied, finally swallowing the lump in her throat. Patricia narrowed her eyes. "You heard, that's all." She approached Jane, who felt the heat of her presence like an unbearable weight. Jane knew she was in trouble. "Yes, Auntie," she finally relented, "but I have nothing to do with it." Patricia laughed, but it was a cold laugh. "You think you're going to get away with this, don't you? There's no hiding. I'll make sure you ... play a role in this. You'll understand your worth, Jane." With those words, Patricia strode out of the kitchen with her commanding presence. And with that, Jane knew her life was about to change forever. A few weeks later, the mood at Patricia's house was different. Preparations for the arrival of Mr. Wellington's son, Derek, were underway. Jane sensed something was wrong, as if she were a disposable part of her aunt's grand plan. While Lucia prepared to impress Derek, Karina stood aloof, her eyes indifferent, but, at the same time, a growing curiosity. Jane knew Karina wasn't entirely oblivious to the situation, but her behavior was becoming increasingly contradictory. It was as if she were torn between following in her mother's footsteps or seeking something more genuine, something different. The night before the big date, Jane was called to one last task. Her Aunt Patricia didn't seem willing to give anyone a break. "Jane, I need you to do something for me," Patricia said with an enigmatic smile. "You're going to make sure everything is perfect." Down to the last detail, Jane just nodded, her heart racing. Something told her this wasn't just about cooking dinner or cleaning. It was something bigger, something that had to do with the role she was supposed to play in this dangerous game. And when the big day finally arrived, Jane felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Patricia seemed to be watching her daughter's every move with an attention bordering on obsession. Derek's arrival wasn't just a social event, but the decisive moment when Patricia believed her daughter Lucia would finally get what she deserved. But Karina was still an unknown, a factor that could change everything. While everyone was preparing for the event, Jane had an unexpected encounter. She was in the kitchen, taking care of the final details, when the door opened and Derek Wellington walked in. Jane felt a shock. She had never imagined she would find him there, in the kitchen of the house where she was trapped. "You're lost in your thoughts, aren't you?" Derek asked, with a sincere smile that made Jane's heart race. "No. It's nothing," she replied quickly, trying not to appear nervous. But it was impossible to hide the feeling that this was a turning point in the plot of her life. "Can I help you?" Derek asked again, looking at her with genuine interest. Jane felt uneasy. How did he know she was there? Her curiosity about Derek only grew, but she didn't know if she could trust him. She was aware that, despite his impeccable manners and charming appearance, he was part of a much larger world, one she might never reach. Before Jane could answer, the sound of quick footsteps echoed through the house. Patricia appeared with a warm smile, but with a look that made it clear she knew exactly what was happening. "Derek, my dear, I'm so glad you're here. We'll give you a warm welcome," Patricia said, her voice soft but firm. She approached Derek, leading him to the dining room where Lucia and Karina were already waiting. Jane, however, couldn't take her eyes off Derek. Something in her had changed, and she felt her life was about to be radically altered. The house seemed smaller now, her footsteps heavier, as if the future were unfolding before her eyes. She didn't know where it would take her, but one thing was certain: things would never be the same again. After dinner, their gazes began to change. Jane was walking away from the room when Lucia approached her, her gaze piercing. "Are you sure this wasn't done on purpose?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "You seem awfully close to Derek for someone who shouldn't even be in the room." Jane tried not to show her discomfort. "It wasn't like that at all, Lucia. I was just helping." The tension between them was rising, and Jane knew she couldn't afford to make a mistake. Any false move, and Patricia, who seemed to be always watching, could turn her life into an even bigger nightmare. But something inside her compelled her to continue. Something that made her question how far she would go to find out the truth. Derek seemed genuinely interested in her, but that only made everything more complicated. Patricia wouldn't let him see who Jane really was, and she knew it. Every step she took toward Derek could cost her everything she already had, even the chance for a different future. But what else could she do? Would she remain silent, submit to this life of eternal submission, or would she dare to defy her aunt and the expectations placed upon her? The game was about to get even more dangerous, and in Jane's heart, a flame of rebellion began to grow. The next morning was tense. Jane woke early, as she always did, but something felt different. Her gaze was firmer, her posture more erect. There was something inside her that could no longer be ignored. Derek's presence the night before, his genuine way of treating Jane as if she were someone important, had stirred her in a way she couldn't understand. And most difficult of all, it made her question her own choices and the path she'd always been expected to follow. As Patricia prepared for a new meeting with Derek, Jane knew the pressure on her was mounting. Every step she took closer to Derek meant a step closer to discovering something that could change her life forever. But at the same time, she knew her aunt wouldn't allow it. Patricia had her own plans that didn't include Jane as anything more than a disposable tool. "Jane," Patricia called, interrupting her niece's thoughts. "You're going to do this right, aren't you?" she said with a coldness that cut through the air. Jane swallowed hard, knowing any mistake would be fatal. "Yes, Auntie, of course," she replied, her voice trembling but resolute. The clock was ticking against her. When Derek arrived, her life would be transformed, but how? What was she willing to risk to achieve something she never imagined possible? Dinner with Derek was scheduled for that evening, and Jane knew he wasn't just any guest. He was the key to something greater, perhaps the key to freedom, perhaps the key to escape the gilded prison that was Patricia's house. The dilemma was on her mind. Follow the rules, keep the peace, and remain submissive, or take the risk of defying her aunt and possibly changing everything. Evening fell, and the air felt thick with tension. Everyone was preparing for the grand dinner, and Jane felt her stomach churn. She was on edge, caught between the desire to remain invisible and the need to show herself as someone other than just a servant. When Derek re-entered the house, the entire atmosphere seemed to shift. His calm gaze, his relaxed posture, and the smile he offered Jane were enough to make her feel something she had never experienced before. Recognition. Patricia naturally tried to take control of the situation, guiding Derek into the spotlight. But Jane noticed something in his demeanor. Despite Lucia's posture and Karina's coldness, Something was happening between Derek and her. He watched her with more interest than she had ever imagined anyone could. His every gesture seemed to indicate that he saw something beyond the housekeeper, something Jane had never allowed herself to believe possible. While the others chatted, Jane remained silent, observing everything from afar. But her heart beat faster with each passing second. She knew she was in a minefield. With every word exchanged with Derek, she took a step closer to crumbling the facade Patricia had carefully constructed. Jane tried to focus on the evening's tasks, but she couldn't ignore what was happening inside her. She couldn't keep pretending nothing was changing. After dinner, as everyone retired to their respective seats, Derek did something unexpected. He approached Jane, a small smile on his face. "Jane," he said softly, "are you going to tell me what's going on here? Why don't you join us? Everyone's talking, and you seem to be part of something bigger." The gentleness of his words made Jane's heart race, but she wasn't sure if she could trust him. I can't," she replied quickly, avoiding looking directly at him. I have my place here." Derek stared at her with an intensity that made Jane feel exposed. He moved closer, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be invisible, Jane. I see you. I know there's more to you than this place allows. Don't let it dictate your life." Jane froze. He had touched the deepest wound in her existence. Could she truly free herself? Or was she just dreaming of an impossible reality? In the days that followed, Jane couldn't get Derek out of her head. His words echoed in her mind, but Patricia's fear was still strong. She knew that if she were discovered, nothing could protect her from the consequences. Patricia was a ruthless woman, and her obsession with controlling her daughters was evident. But now, something inside Jane was changing. She felt there was a chance, a small chance, of achieving something different, something better, and she couldn't let fear paralyze her. Karina, for her part, was behaving strangely. Jane knew she was torn. Despite all the family rivalries and Lucia's teasing, Karina didn't seem all that enthusiastic about being chosen by Derek as his future wife. She seemed more like a spectator, watching everything from afar with a weary look in her eyes. Jane didn't know what Karina was thinking, but there was something different about her. She didn't have the same relentless ambition as Lucia, and that made her a harder person to read. And then the inevitable happened. Patricia called Jane into her office. Her aunt's look was no longer one of curiosity, but of suppressed anger. "Jane," Patricia said, "I don't know what's going on between you and Derek, but if you think you're going to get away with this, you're sorely mistaken." Her tone was sharp, like a razor's edge. Jane felt herself tighten, her heart racing. "I don't know what you're talking about, Aunt." "You don't know. You can't fool me anymore, Jane. I've seen the way he looks at you. Don't forget your place. If you dare step outside the boundaries of this house, I'll make sure you never have a chance again. And Derek, ... he's mine. No one will steal him from me." Patricia advanced on Jane, her words weighing like stones on her chest. Jane felt a surge of anger, but also a strange sense of relief. She was no longer alone in this game. Something inside her had finally broken free, and she knew what she had to do. It was Jane's last chance. She knew that after that confrontation, nothing would be the same. It was now or never. That night, while everyone was in the dining room, Jane made her choice. She walked into the room where Derek stood, his presence imposing but his mind firm. "Derek," she called, her voice soft but filled with determination. He turned to her, surprised, but soon his smile appeared. "Jane," he replied, with the same gentleness she now knew so well. "What's going on? You seem different." She looked directly into his eyes, feeling her heart race. "I need help, Derek. I don't know what to do anymore. My life... My life has never been mine. I'm trapped. Patricia controls me, and I need to change that. Can you help me?" Silence fell between them, but this time there was no fear. Just a decision made. Derek looked at her, his eyes full of understanding. "I'll help you, Jane. Together, we'll figure out what to do." The game had finally changed. Jane, Derek, and Karina now shared a common goal. What happened next? Well, that's something no one could have predicted, but what remained clear was that Jane would no longer be a pawn in Patricia's hands. She had chosen her own destiny. And you, what do you think will happen to Jane? Will she be able to break free? Comment below and don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any chapter of this incredible story. The change began to take shape much faster than Jane could have imagined. After that moment with Derek, something in the household dynamic began to unravel. Patricia, a master player, quickly realized she had lost control of something fundamental. She knew that Jane, even though she was still somewhat submissive, was beginning to break free from the bonds that bound her. But Patricia was stubborn. The final confrontation between them was only a matter of time. The house was filled with tension the next day. Patricia was quieter than usual, watching everyone with her sharp eyes, trying to understand what was happening. Jane remained silent, fulfilling her tasks, but feeling a different weight in the air. The simple fact of having made her choice seemed to have given her life a new direction. She was no longer the submissive young woman who acted only out of obligation. Something inside her had awakened, and now she was a woman with a purpose. Labucha, on the other hand, was confused. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but her behavior revealed insecurity. She, who had always been Patricia's favorite, now found her position threatened. Jane, previously invisible, was now the center of a dynamic no one understood. Lucia tried repeatedly to get closer to Derek, but something in her posture and attitude caused him to distance himself. He was no longer that easygoing man who accepted control. He now seemed to have his own vision of what was right, and that included treating Jane with respect and consideration. But the real turning point came when Karina, who had previously maintained a distant and indifferent demeanor, began to openly question Patricia's methods. During dinner, she uttered a phrase no one expected to hear. "I can't take this anymore. I never wanted this power play, but it seems I'm forced to be a part of it, don't I?" Karina stood up from the table, disrupting the uncomfortable atmosphere, and all eyes turned to her. Jane remained silent. Watching Lucia's younger sister, Karina, was tired. She no longer wanted to be the puppet, as she had always been. Patricia's family was falling apart, and Jane knew this could be the moment she'd been waiting for, a chance to make something of herself. Patricia, of course, didn't like Karina's defiance one bit. Her piercing look of hatred made everyone at the table feel the weight of her words. "Do you really think you can talk to me like that?" Patricia asked, her voice cold and threatening. Karina didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do. You don't own everything here anymore, and I won't follow your rules anymore." In that moment, Jane felt a sudden relief. Karina was finally waking up to reality. Now, they were in a position where they could fight for their rights if together they were strong enough. But they knew the battle wasn't yet won. The real showdown was just beginning. The following days were like a countdown. Jane, Karina, and Derek bonded silently but firmly. They knew Patricia wouldn't be easily defeated. The matriarch of the house was becoming increasingly suspicious. She sensed something was wrong, that her control was slipping through her fingers. That's when she did the unthinkable. One night, when everyone was gathered for dinner, Patricia, in a calculated move, made Derek a proposal that couldn't be ignored. "Derek," she said, with a soft smile that didn't hide her malicious intent, "we know you're a very busy businessman, but how about joining forces with us? Join our family. Make Lucia the woman you deserve, and the future will be yours." Jane felt a knot in her stomach. She already knew what was coming next. Patricia was trying to ensure her power was maintained, but Derek, once again, surprised her. "Patricia, I understand your intentions, but I can't marry someone just for convenience. I'm not interested in anyone in your family, and that includes your daughters." Derek's words cut like a knife. Patricia, furious, tried to remain calm, but the blow was deep. Derek was finally taking control of his own life, and that meant he would no longer bow to Patricia's pressure. The war was lost for her. But the worst was yet to come. Patricia, knowing she had failed Derek, turned her anger on Jane. She called her into her office, and the tension between them was higher than ever. "You think you can manipulate everyone here? You think you can challenge my authority?" Patricia shouted, her voice thick with hatred. Jane, who had been prepared for this moment, didn't flinch. She looked directly into her aunt's eyes with a strength Patricia had never known existed within her. "I never wanted to manipulate anyone. I just want to live my life. And if that means I have to leave here to be happy, then I will. I won't live under your control anymore." The silence that followed was profound. Patricia, in her anger, advanced on Jane, but this time Jane didn't back down. She took a step forward, her eyes full of determination. Derek and Karina were close, ready to intervene, but something in Jane's posture made Patricia back away. She knew she had lost control. Finally, she was facing the revolt she had always feared. Patricia, gritting her teeth, said nothing more. She knew the battle had been lost. Jane, Karina, and Derek were united, and nothing could stop the new direction they were about to take. In the following days, everything changed. Jane was finally able to leave Patricia's house. She was no longer the silent, submissive maid. Now she had control of her life. She found a place where she could be who she truly was, without fear of being crushed by a controlling aunt. Derek, in turn, proved to be a true friend and ally. He not only cared about Jane as a woman, but as a person with her own strength and worth. Their relationship grew, but more importantly, Jane freed herself from the chains of her toxic family. Karina, too, found her own path. She began working for herself and distancing herself from her mother's domination. And, contrary to Patricia's expectations, she found freedom in her own life choices. The support between the three figures, Jane, Karina, and Derek, was now unbreakable. Patricia, isolated in her grand mansion, had to accept the loss of everything she had tried to control. There was no longer room for her to impose her will on the people who truly mattered. And finally, what seemed like a prison to Jane became her gateway to the world. And now, what do you think will happen to Patricia? Will she learn her lesson, or will she try to control her life in another way? Leave your opinion in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapters of this twist-filled story. Patricia was not a woman to accept defeat easily, although she had been defeated in the battle against Jane, Karina, and Derek. Her pride was an unbeatable army. Knowing her authority was at risk and that she had lost control over her family, Patricia began orchestrating a last-ditch attempt to regain power. She no longer cared about appearances. What she wanted now was revenge. And who would be the most obvious target, if not the person who had turned everything upside down? Jane. One day, while Jane was recovering from her newly gained freedom, the message arrived. Patricia, as always, knew exactly how to manipulate situations. She made a surprising move. She sent an invitation to Jane and Karina. The reason? A reconciliation dinner. According to Patricia, Jane knew what was behind it was yet another trap. But at the same time, something inside her told her this was the final moment. The moment she would finally be able to sever ties with that house for good. Derek, who had always stayed by Jane's side, looked at her with a worried expression. "Are you sure you're going to this dinner? She's trying to play a game and you know it." Jane smiled, a smile that wasn't one of fear, but of pure confidence. "I know, Derek, but this is the last time. I need to end this once and for all. I can't live with this burden anymore." But Karina, who had also been invited, was visibly hesitant. "Jane, I don't know. What if she tries something against you?" She was genuinely worried. Deep down, Karina knew how dangerous her mother could be, and she feared for Jane's safety. "I'll go alone, Karina. You don't need to get any more involved than you already are. I promise you everything will be okay," Jane replied with a calmness that surprised even herself. She was no longer the fragile girl Patricia used to control. She was a woman who finally had the power to decide her own destiny. On the night of the dinner, the atmosphere in Patricia's house was tense, like a storm about to break. Jane arrived first, accompanied by Derek, who watched her with particular care. They entered the mansion Jane knew so well, but this time she no longer felt the weight that had previously suffocated her. She was strong, determined, and ready to take the final step. Patricia appeared next, dressed with an elegance that didn't hide the coldness in her gaze. Lucia and Karina were seated at the table, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Karina still didn't know what her role in this game would be, but her loyalties were clearly divided. She was beginning to see Patricia for her true face, a manipulative and selfish woman who had always used her daughters as pieces on a chessboard. Patricia, with a forced smile, gestured for Jane to sit. "I'm glad you decided to come, Jane. There's no reason for the past to separate us anymore, is there?" Her voice was soft, but the tension in the room was palpable. She was trying to control the situation once again, but Jane was ready to turn the tables. "No, Aunt," Jane replied firmly. "The past needs to stay where it is. I'm no longer your shadow." She sat calmly, looking Patricia in the eye with a confidence she'd never felt before. Lucia, trying to keep up appearances, intervened with a forced smile. "Oh, Jane, always so serious. This isn't a dinner to discuss the past, is it?" But there was a venom hidden in her words, something Jane couldn't miss. Karina, who was beginning to distance herself from her mother, looked at Jane for reassurance. But Jane said nothing. She already knew that if Karina wanted to help, it would be on her own terms, not under pressure. The food was served, but the real focus of the evening wasn't dinner, but the words that were about to be spoken. Patricia, trying once again to manipulate the situation, began talking about the good times they'd had as a family. "I always thought it would be you, Lucia, who would take the lead," she said, looking fondly at her daughter. "But now I see you and Karina have a lot to offer. What do you think about making up with Derek? I think he'd be a good option, don't you?" Jane could barely contain her laughter at Patricia's brazenness. But before she could respond, Derek intervened with a calmness only he possessed. "No, Patricia, we're not playing this game anymore. I'm not here to be manipulated." He looked directly at Jane, the confidence in his eyes reflecting her strength. It was as if he was saying, "Now it's your turn." The room fell silent. Lucia looked at Derek in disbelief, while Karina, already beginning to understand the game, tried to avoid her mother's gaze, but Patricia didn't flinch. "What are you saying, Derek? I'm just trying to help. Isn't that what everyone wants? A future ... together." Her voice, once controlled, now trembled, the anger of realizing she'd lost her lead becoming evident. Jane, with surprising calm, looked at Patricia and said, The future you talk so much about, Aunt, no longer belongs to us. I'm no longer part of this game. You tried to control everything, including your own daughter's life, but what you didn't know was that we had already made our choices. We are not your puppets." Patricia remained silent. She knew she had lost the battle, but her pride still prevented her from admitting defeat. The next morning, Patricia's house no longer seemed the same. Jane, now free from her aunt's bonds, no longer looked back. The weight she carried had disappeared, and the future lay before her, clear and unfettered. Her relationship with Derek and Karina became stronger, more genuine. They were no longer allies in a power struggle, but friends and partners on a new journey. Patricia, for her part, remained in her mansion, isolated and out of control, with nothing left to lose. Her plans had failed, and her family had turned away from her. Lucia, over time, also began to see the flaws in everything Patricia had tried to impose. And although she still struggled with the idea of change, something inside her began to break. Karina, alongside Jane, became the person she always wanted to be: independent, free, and capable of making her own decisions. The support between them grew, and together the two sisters, with Derek's support, began to build a new life without Patricia's shadow, and so the game of manipulation came to an end. Jane had finally freed herself from the emotional prison Patricia had tried to build around her. The future was hers, and no one could control her anymore. And now, what do you think Patricia's future holds? Will she learn a lesson, or will she continue her insane quest for power? And what about Jane? Has she finally achieved the freedom she so richly deserved? Comment below what you think will happen. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next adventures and twists. Jane, now more confident than ever, was ready to begin her new life. After years of submission and fear, she had finally gained her freedom. The house that had once felt like a maze of manipulation and control was now empty of power, free of the invisible chains Patricia had created to imprison her. She no longer felt the weight of her aunt's gazes, nor the pressure to please or meet Lucia's expectations. None of that mattered anymore. Derek, with his calm and assured approach, was by her side, offering the support she so desperately needed. Together, they began to plan their future. No longer a life of obedience or subjection, but a journey based on choice, freedom, and the right to be who she truly was. Karina, her spirit now renewed, followed the same path, although still grappling with the remnants of Patricia's upbringing. She began to realize the strength she had always possessed, but never knew how to access. Over time, she moved further away from her mother's influence, establishing her own independence. Jane and Karina became more than sisters. They became friends, companions in struggle and dream. Meanwhile, Patricia, the matriarch of it all, found herself increasingly isolated. Her empire of control had crumbled. Her daughters had drifted away, Derek was no longer part of her plans, and loneliness consumed her. Even with all her wealth and power, what she could not control was the love and loyalty of those around her. The reality of her life without the ability to manipulate others was a sentence of unbearable loneliness. In the days that followed, Patricia tried, in vain, to rebuild what she had lost. She began visiting her old friends, trying to regain her influence in the upper echelons of society. But with each encounter, she realized that the perception of her had changed. The image of a strong, determined woman had become a distant memory. What people now saw was a selfish, calculating woman who had lost everything to her thirst for control. Doors began to close, and no matter how hard she tried to reinvent herself, there was no longer room for her in the world she knew. Patricia, who once commanded with a sharp gaze and an iron fist, now faced the bitter reality that her control over her family and society no longer existed. Every attempt at manipulation was thwarted by those who, in the past, had been so willing to blindly follow her. Her cries and attempts to re-establish dominance fell on deaf ears. She, who thought she was an unbeatable woman, now found herself hostage to her own pride and her inability to change. While her wealth still afforded her some ostentation, the void in her life was impossible to fill. What Patricia didn't know was that true strength lay not in controlling others, but in being able to control oneself and choose a different path when things began to fall apart. As Patricia grappled with the weight of her loss, Jane and Karina began to embrace new opportunities. They not only freed themselves from the past, but also began to dream of a future free from their mother's chains. Their lives were no longer at the mercy of the expectations of a woman who used her strength to crush others. Now they were shaping their own destinies. Derek, who always believed in Jane's potential, was instrumental in this process. He encouraged her to pursue her own interests, develop her skills, and build a future that was truly hers. Together, they began investing in projects that resonated with what they believed most deeply: freedom, personal growth, and the chance to create something unique. Jane, for example, began studying entrepreneurship, seeking to build her own company, a space where women could work without fear of reprisal or being treated as inferior. Karina, with her passion for design, started her own clothing line, working with local designers and promoting ethical and inclusive fashion. They were both creating something that was not only financially viable, but also reflected the values of freedom and justice they had finally embraced. Meanwhile, Derek pursued his own business ventures, always supporting Jane and Karina, but also respecting their space to grow on their own. The dynamic between the three was one of companionship and mutual respect without domination or manipulation. Finally, Jane and Karina were free to make their own choices. Even with everything she had lost, Patricia would not give up. Pride was stronger than reason, and she didn't want to accept that her power was gone. The family she thought she controlled was now distant and oblivious to her suffering. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Patricia tried one last move. She sought out Karina, promising her wealth and status in exchange for her loyalty. Karina, who was finally finding her own identity, looked at her mother with a look of sadness. "Mum, you still don't understand, do you? I don't want this anymore. I don't need your lies and manipulations to be happy." Karina had freed herself from the burden of needing Patricia's approval. She knew that true happiness lay in building a life based on what she believed was right, not what her mother wanted. Patricia's attempt to manipulate Karina failed again. This time, Karina didn't give in. She made her decision definitively, telling Patricia that she would not return to the world of lies and manipulation she had built. After many months of failed attempts to reconcile with her daughters, Patricia finally found herself alone. But contrary to what one might expect, Jane and Karina did not carry hatred in their hearts. They had suffered, yes, but the pain of the past had transformed into strength. And now they were determined to move forward, no longer as victims, but as free women. Jane decided that, although she could never forget everything that had happened, she was ready to forgive her aunt, not to please her or empower her, but to free herself from the pain that guilt and resentment caused. Forgiveness did not mean reconciliation, but a way to move forward without the weight of the past. Karina, her heart finally light, also made peace with what had happened, but she knew that the most important thing was that she had found her own identity and her own happiness. Over time, Jane and Karina built a new and prosperous life. They became an example of strength, determination, and freedom for many other women around the world. What once seemed like a life of fear and submission became a story of overcoming and victory. Jane, now a successful businesswoman, became an inspiration for all those seeking freedom and independence. Karina, with her innovative and inclusive fashion brand, conquered her niche in the market and also became a symbol of resistance. And Derek, always by their side, became more than an ally. He was the support they needed, not to rescue them, but to give them the strength they needed to rescue themselves. Jane and Karina's story, despite adversity, ended with the certainty that when you free yourself from the chains of the past and take control of your destiny, the future opens up before you, full of opportunities and possibilities. And now, what do you think the future holds for Jane and Karina? Will they be able to maintain their freedom and continue to thrive? And Patricia, will she ever find peace? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more amazing and inspiring stories.